Hello, this is David Beeson welcoming you to Chapter 3 of A History of Spain. You've heard the expression, might makes right. This week we're going to discover how, in prehistoric Spain, wealth made might. We're going to look at two extraordinary communities where with growing wealth there was also growing class division. There were the rich with power and the poor without so much. Both societies, however, proved vulnerable and were subject to all sorts of shocks that led to their decline and eventual failure. There were ecological problems, we think, perhaps climate change. There were also economic problems, new developments, new technologies. And there may have been internal tensions as well. If you're drawing any parallels between all this and what's happening in our own times, I invite you to go right ahead and draw the parallels. Are you ready to spend a little time in the topmost levels of society? In the rarefied atmosphere that the high and mighty breathe? Rubbing shoulders with the great and the good? Well, the great and the good as they themselves define greatness and goodness. And who am I to say otherwise? We're talking about the 3rd millennium BCE, before the Common Era. So we're certainly talking about our elders. Whether or not we're talking about our betters, I'll leave it to you to judge. Spoiler alert, I don't think they were that different from us. Last week we got as far as the year 2000 BCE. This week we're going to start a good 1,000 years before that. But don't worry. We're only stepping back in order to get a better run-up and a leap into the extraordinary period, or perhaps I should say periods, that followed. Los Millares is a prehistoric town whose ruins stand on a hilltop surrounded by concentric circles of walls with towers and bastions and defensive outworks. We're still dealing with people who left no written records. But it doesn't take any formal documentation to realise that they were highly organised, skilled in coordinating labour for major projects, and worried enough about the prospect of external attacks to invest heavily in defending against them. In our previous 2 episodes, we talked about the way agriculture had sometimes created surpluses and that had produced wealth. Wealth generated wealthy people who didn't have to spend all their time working on basic subsistence, collecting or growing food. What's more, we saw that kind of wealth could become a temptation for other people to raid and try to take it for themselves. That in turn led to societies who could afford to support warriors to have a warrior group that would defend their property, or even perhaps sometimes go raiding to grab somebody else's. Coordinating the building of defences and leading the warriors was the task of a group of people we could think of as rulers, or at least as a collection of people forming an elite. And of course alongside them were priests who explained to everybody that what the elite and the warriors were doing was exactly what the gods had ordained. Leaders didn't only direct warriors. They could also organise work to build protection for their town, like the fortifications at Los Millares. That extended the elite's authority into many areas of the life of a settlement like Los Millares, which was much more like a town than the kind of villages we've been talking about before. How did the elites manage to maintain that authority? Well, controlling armed groups didn't just make them well equipped for providing external defence, it also allowed them to oppress out of existence any kind of internal resistance. They could direct others to do their will and make their lives pretty unpleasant if they didn't. But there was another powerful hold over people too. The eminent American and Spanish anthropologist Antonio Gilman came up with some interesting ideas some decades ago. He talked about what he called capital-intensive subsistence. That means adopting ways of producing food which required significant investment either in labour or in other resources. In simplified terms, you could imagine that someone, or perhaps someone's extended family, has just cleared a new field from the woodlands. They then turn over the earth and plant it with seed. That would make them more than a little disinclined to give up that land if things turned unpleasant and, say, a local chief began to demand rather more of them than they felt he was entitled to. They might, despite that bad feeling, decide that, well, having put all that effort into clearing that field, it would be a mistake to walk away and that it was better to comply with the chief's demands than to resist them and give up what they'd built for themselves. And that's while it's only a field. Imagine if they'd gone much further and done something like plant olive trees or vines, both of which began to be cultivated in the course of the 3rd millennium BCE. Both of those take a lot longer to start bearing fruit, and they represent a bigger investment in the first place. Again, something you don't want to walk away from, and for which you're prepared to put up with a certain degree at least, or a very high degree, of maybe excessive authority exercised by an elite class. A slightly different approach to these questions was proposed by another anthropologist, Timothy Earle, who was heavily influenced by economic thinking. He argued in terms of control over resources, from which emerged the ideas of property. They may well have been motivated by the same kind of thinking as Gilman outlined. You've made the effort, you've made the investment, what you've produced is therefore yours. That could go, for instance, for the field that you've just cleared. Now, it can be argued that something like land on which we all depend and on which we all live shouldn't ever be privately owned. In many ways, it's very like the air we breathe, which nobody has yet managed to find a way of making their own and then charging others to use. Thank God. In practice, though, many human societies from back then to right now have regarded land as something that could be turned into private property. And don't forget that the word private comes from the same root as privation. In other words, it's an exclusionary idea. It's not just saying that this property is yours, it's saying it isn't anybody else's. The sign on a property doesn't say, "This is where I live," it says, "Keep out." To support his argument, Earle points to the traces many archaeologists have found in many places of ancient field boundaries. But of course nothing says this isn't yours more powerfully than fortifications. Los Millares had wealth. It regarded that wealth as its own property, and that property is intended to defend against anybody else challenging for it. This leads us to a kind of final step. Just picture a conversation between a member of the elite and someone from far further down the social pile who's trying to cultivate some crops. "Yes," says the mighty one, "you regard this field as yours, but you can only do that because I protect it with my authority and my warriors. So really it's mine, and it's only out of my generosity that I allow you to treat it as yours. So from now on you're going to match my generosity with yours by handing over a little more of your surplus production to me. In return, I'll protect your right to go on producing it." Taxes, you see. Quite a few centuries later, Benjamin Franklin would be telling us that only death and taxes were certain in life. Well, by the Los Millares period, humanity had had plenty of time to get used to death. Since then, we've become pretty accustomed to taxes too. All that is visible at Los Millares, not necessarily within the remains of the town, but in what surrounds them. Because all around Los Millares are tombs known as toloi, from a later Greek word, which are large chambers in which bodies could be buried. They're approached by tunnels through which the sun now can shine in a spectacular way. And inside were collective burials of many people from the community. They were all mixed up together, but not necessarily equally. You could tell that from the grave goods, the objects that were buried with people to accompany them into their death. At Los Millares, you could see how they revealed the growing inequality that accompanied increasing wealth. There were bodies buried with splendid grave goods, and then there were others buried with far less, and some with nothing at all. Social ranks were perhaps not fully fixed yet, but they were beginning to form. There were groups that had a great deal, and there were groups who had very little. Given the emergence of these different groups of haves and have-nots, it's not hard to guess, is it, which ones were directing the building of the fortifications at Los Millares and which ones were holding the stones into place. The evidence suggests that Los Millares got going at about 3200 BCE, a little more than 5 millennia ago, 5,000 years. It lasted some 9 centuries, but at around 2300 BCE, it somehow disappeared. There's no evidence to say that the disappearance happened overnight, but it did decline and vanish. We're not quite sure why, and several factors may have been responsible. It's possible that the climate in this semi-arid area of southeast Spain gradually became drier as rains perhaps failed, or indeed it's possible too that overworked agricultural land began to be exhausted. There may also have been economic factors at work. Los Millares became a major centre for copper work in what was, after all, the Copper Age. It had significant deposits of copper ore nearby, a major advantage at a time when it was difficult to transport large quantities of such heavy and bulky material. And we know from chemical analysis that copper from Los Millares was distributed widely, suggesting that it produced for exchange and not just for its own use. But at around 2300 BCE, a major transition happened around Europe, which would affect Los Millares fundamentally. The Copper Age gave way to the Bronze Age. Bronze isn't a naturally occurring metal. It has to be made by combining, or alloying as it's called, with other metals, most commonly tin. Tin is much rarer than copper, and there was very little of it available locally in southeast Spain. Instead, it had to come from further afield in Iberia, or perhaps from even more remote places in other parts of Atlantic Europe. So the advantages that Los Millares had enjoyed of having local deposits of copper ore mattered much less. What mattered now was access to networks, the ability to acquire tin, to transport materials over long distances, and to control their distribution. There was also a technological shift. Los Millares had learned to use smelting, the technique of separating copper from ore, which requires the use of heat. But the Bronze Age required something far more, alloying, and that too requires heat, but it then involves molten metals being mixed in the right proportions at the right time. Copper could also be worked by hammering, though there's evidence that Los Millares also did cast some copper, that is, pour it molten into moulds. But with bronze, casting became an essential task. Molten metal was poured into moulds, allowing the production of standardized objects to high levels of quality and in much higher numbers. That required a different set of skills, not just the aptitude to work with metals, but the ability to manage processes, to control temperatures and proportions, to coordinate materials and timings. It also required a different working environment, in a workshop rather than out of doors, and perhaps under closer supervision than when working with copper. In short, we're looking at something of a technological revolution, and we know what kind of impact they can have. I mean, think of photocopiers and how they've been marginalised by the use of personal computers and printers. Or come to that, one of my favourites, the use of the ring pull on a can, which has more or less replaced the can opener entirely, except when, infuriatingly, the ring pull breaks when you need to go finding a can opener again. And that's without even mentioning the AI revolution, which could ultimately go so far as to make even podcasters like us completely redundant. The impact back then was just as dramatic. It was a change not only in what people made, but in how they made it and who controlled the making. Copper tied communities to places. Bronze tied them to networks, and it tended to encourage more hierarchical control. That had consequences, because control over those networks for the supply of tin and over the production process itself could make groups or individuals more powerful. And control of production, and therefore of wealth, was an exercise of that power. This brings us to the next stage in our exciting story. As we saw in the last episode, the absence of written records leads to archaeologists naming communities after the first site they excavate. So, please welcome the appearance on the stage of the El Argar culture. That's even though El Argar, in what is now Almeria, was by no means one of the most important of the culture's sites. Like Los Millares, Argaric settlements were on hilltops or other defensible sites and were fortified. They were densely built and carefully planned, suggesting the existence of a central authority over each of them. That, of course, funnily enough, mirrors the needs of the major new process of the age we're just entering, the production of bronze. It required tighter control than the production of copper. Some of these settlements, such as La Bastida de Totana, grew to considerable size, so that some archaeologists actually call them proto-urban, in other words, precursors of cities. Again, as in Los Millares, graves are a major source of information about the culture. Bodies are still being buried with grave objects, with the rich having very fine ones, middling people rather more modest ones, and the poor with few or none at all. A big difference from Los Millares, though, is that the graves were no longer collective, they were individual. Bodies were often buried in large jars, known as pitoi, again from later Greek, or in large stone boxes, cists. They're frequently under the floors in houses. What is even more telling is that in some of the wealthier graves, there are skeletons of children or adolescents. That suggests a high status they can hardly have attained themselves through their own merits. What clearer indication is there that they gained it from birth? In other words, membership of the elite had become hereditary. Burials inside houses suggest a desire to keep the family together, both dead and alive, suggesting that households matter more than the community. We are a family with our ancestors and descendants, they seem to be saying, and we regard ourselves as distinct from, and perhaps superior to, the others. In general, social stratification seems to be even more rigid than in Los Millares, suggesting the emergence of a real class system. Some of the grave objects include swords, usually with male skeletons, suggesting the existence of a warrior group, perhaps inside or at any rate close to the elite. Taken together with the fortifications, this suggests that these societies were expecting attacks and were prepared to invest to repel them. Equally, they had force at their disposal that could be used to suppress internal dissent. And then in La Almoloya, an agaric site in present-day Murcia, there's the most striking burial of all. A building near the centre includes a large hall capable of sitting 40 or 50 people. Now, obviously, we don't know exactly what purpose it served, but it does look like a meeting place where the great and the good could come together to take decisions affecting the whole community. Interestingly, there is a grave in that hall. The grave contained a skeleton with a silver diadem lying by the skull. A diadem? Is that just one step removed from a crown? Certainly, both the location of the grave and the presence of the diadem suggests that we're dealing with somebody important, possibly powerful. But here's an astonishing discovery for societies we like to think of as backward, certainly more primitive than ours. The skeleton is that of a woman. Did women in Argaric society wield power? Or at least were they not completely excluded from it? At any rate, what seems certain is that Argaric society was organised into classes. At the top seems to have been a ruling elite, which may have included women, and membership of which was inheritable. Then there were warriors and craftsmen and farmers and herders, and quite possibly subordinate and dependent classes below them. The next strange thing about Argar was its end, because it had an end. Just like Los Millares, there came a time when it disappeared. This was in around 1550 BCE. At least one factor may have been common to both collapses. The El Argar culture and Los Millares were both in the semi-arid southeast of the Iberian Peninsula. It's possible that failing rainfall or simply worked out agricultural land may have undermined the viability of both communities. There may also have been economic problems in changes in trading networks, making it more difficult to obtain the tin which was used for the bronze that gave Argar much of its power and its prosperity. Its rigid social stratification, which made of Argar what some archaeologists think of as the earliest state, certainly assisted Argar's progress while conditions were good. But both the possible problems in agriculture and in the trading networks would have reduced the wealth within those societies that was already badly distributed between the classes. That might very well have heightened tensions between them. If you think about our own times, you may well agree that economic difficulties can sharpen internal social tensions. Archaeologists have discovered destruction levels in El Argar, that is to say, layers within the soil that show signs of burning or violence or abandonment. That may suggest that warfare played a role in the decline of Argaric society, or it may suggest that there were internal uprisings and battles to try to suppress them. Either way, such destructive episodes may well have contributed to the decline and failure of Argaric society. Well, we promised last week that we'd introduce you to two outstanding communities in the east and south of Spain. This week, we've looked at El Argar in the east, with Los Millares as the introduction to it. But that still leaves the society in the south. It would bring Iberia into close contact with other communities from far across the Mediterranean. But before we get there, there was a curious and long intervening period between El Argar and it. That's where we're going to start next week. Many thanks for listening.